Carl Hiaasen, welcome to HARDtalk.
Happy to have me on, thank you.
Here we sit in Florida, the state you were born in, raised in, have worked in all your life, and you are still here. What keeps you in the state that you confess is crazy?
I think it's where my family is from. I think one of the things about writers is you have to care about what you write about, and as messed up as this state is, as absolutely screwed up and insane as this state is, I still care about it. All my family's here. I've just, either that or I'm just too lazy to leave. But I will also say that there are weeks when you see the stream of headlines that come out of Florida where even a diehard Floridian says there's got to be someplace better to live and less crazy. And I have those weeks where I just go, what am I doing here?
Take me back to your childhood, because you have portrayed it as a state that was very different. And we're going back to the 50s and the early 60s when you were a kid growing up. It seems like you felt about it in a very different way.
I did, but when I was a kid, we grew up in west of Fort Lauderdale and really on the geographic edge of the Florida Everglades. There were no malls, there were no interstates. So we get on our bikes after school and we ride out and with our fishing rods. It was like a Tom Sawyer sort of existence. And it wasn't anything to do. So we collected snakes and wild animals, brought them home, let them loose in my house, terrified my mother. That was the childhood that I had. It was all of it spent outdoors, really.
Was one of the motivations for you to get into journalism, and for a while it was investigating journalism. Was it to try to explain to yourself and to fellow Floridians what was happening?
I think a lot of it was anger, in the sense that every time I went home from school or went home to visit my folks, there would be something else that disappeared, some other memory that I'd had as a child that disappeared. And it was happening in a way that it was inevitably corrupt. It couldn't have happened in a sane, orderly civilization. It was just whoever had the money got whatever they wanted, and they could build whatever they want. So I think I went into journalism, first of all, because it was a way to carry on a fight for truth, not necessarily taking a position, because you don't, but when you know people are lying, you know they're taking money, and you know that the effect of that impacts the quality of life and the future of all the generations, then it becomes an altruistic thing, because you don't go into journalism for the money. Dear God, even I knew that. But you went in there because you believed in that fight. And so, yeah, I remember being very young and seeing things happening, seeing places start to disappear, places I would ride my bike to, all of a sudden there's a fence and then there's condos going up, and I was pissed. And I think the satire that I wrote later as a novelist, and I think it's one of the great weapons of anger, is humor.
But that's what really intrigues me about you, because I guess in your late 20s, 30s, you flipped in a way. You were a guy who was devoted to sort of finding stuff out, fact-finding. And then it seems you decided that actually you could deliver more truth in a way by not being restricted by the straightforward facts and juicing stuff up with fiction.
Yeah, I had the luxury of being able to live this double life where I still worked for the Herald, and I'd been on the investigative team for years, and then I started doing a column, which is somewhat liberating because you get paid for your opinion, good or bad. But I still had my foot firmly in the newsroom, but at night I would start working. I had these novels as psychotherapy, because at night, I would go home at night and work on the novels. And
what do you mean by psychotherapy?
Well, because in the context of newspaper work, you can't write your own endings. And I had covered too many stories, and I'm talking about crime, politics, the homicides, the gun violence. I'd covered too many stories where there wasn't a good ending, there wasn't a happy ending. But that's the journalism. That's the axiom is they don't send you to the airport if the plane lands safely. And that's how you get conditioned. So to me, I could go home and work on a novel that I knew at the end of this novel, as bizarre and twisted and warped as it might be, at the end, the good guys would be standing and something really horrible is going to happen to the bad. Something horrible and poetic is going to happen to the bad guys.
Yeah, the bad guys get it and the good guys triumph. But in the course of the journey in your novels, an awful lot of horrible stuff happens.
Yeah.
And the overall view of humanity you present is pretty dark and bleak. And most folks are on the take. They usually lie. They do bad stuff in all sorts of different arenas, from sexual to business to politics. It is a dystopian view, in a way, of what we humans are.
It might be for people who don't live here, but for people who live here, they've always looked at the novels as sort of documentaries. I mean, there's hardly anything that is in my novels that either hasn't happened or won't happen eventually. And that's the scary part, is that some of the things that people accuse me of, that they're saying, that's the sickest thing I've ever read. I can pull out a newspaper clip and say, really, this is where it came from.
You could have been a politician. You are rooted in this Floridian culture. You could have run for office, whether it be at state level or even more, but you never did.
Never did. I would have had no chance of winning and no chance of lasting in office, because you have to do the dance. You have to compromise. You have to appeal to all factions. You have to be diplomatic, and I'm none of those things. None. And I never have even imagined it, because I am not psychologically suited for politics, and you have to know your limitations.
Let's talk about the one politician today who dominates all talk of politics in the United States, a man who in many ways appears more unbelievable than any fictional character ever could, but he is very real when he sits in the White House, Donald Trump. This is what you wrote of Donald Trump, or at least it was the headline on a column you wrote about Donald Trump in March 2015, and I'm not going to spare your embarrassment. It began, "There will never be a President Trump."
I love that column. I wasn't alone. I didn't think it was possible. You mentioned satire, and I thought, well, this would defy satire if this clown got elected, and yet he did. So I was dead wrong. I've been wrong a lot. I also did not think Barack Obama could get elected, because in my lifetime, when I grew up, there were segregated beaches, there were segregated restrooms. The idea of an African American in the White House seemed inconceivable to me.
So what does it say about a country which can elect Barack Obama and then, in the very next election, come up with Donald Trump?
It's so intriguing. It shows what the capacity for hope is, and it shows what the capacity for utter cynicism is on both sides. I think, no, I absolutely didn't think Trump could ever be, and since he's been elected, he's been a nightmare for the country, but a gift to every comedy writer and newspaper columnist, because...
But has he really been a gift? Or actually has he, in a funny sort of way, defused the power of satire? Because as you just said to me, in a sense, satire has no role to play when Donald Trump does things which...
I think in terms of novels and creating a sort of a Tom Wolfe sort of landscape, it's more difficult because of Trump. But in terms of newspaper work and newspaper columns, 750 words, I think you can still have plenty of fun. And I say that I don't think he's killed satire, because in this country, Stephen Colbert's show is the top-rated late night talk show, and all he does, his monologue is all Trump all the time, and it's the most popular show in that time slot in the country.
But there's a humorist in the UK called John O'Farrell who has very publicly worried out loud about satire in the age of Donald Trump, saying, in a way, it's just too easy to subside into laughter and satire and mockery, when in many ways we need to be truly angry. And it goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the balance within you of anger and the desire to entertain and find humor. Sometimes is it important to focus on the anger?
Every funny column I write comes from anger, every single one. Every satirical novel comes from an upwelling of anger.
But diffusing it with the laughter and the smile.
Yeah, but it's different if the people are getting the joke. You're not diffusing it, you're feeding the fire. There's a difference between slapstick and a difference between a satirical line with a very fine edge and a point. And if you get people laughing for the right reasons, you get them thinking about the right things.
I've spoken in the recent past to the editors of both the New York Times and the Washington Post,
Yeah.
and they both say that they are fearful of the atmosphere that they see in the United States today. They are fearful for the security of their own staff.
Yes.
And they are at the top of the masthead of their newspapers. You, on the other hand, are the name that so many people associate with your newspaper, the Miami Herald. I just wonder, in the current climate,
That's
with
what's
your
different.
views and the power of the opposition that you get from people who think Donald Trump is doing great things for America, do you ever consider your own safety and security?
That's what's different now than what it was during Nixon and Newt Gingrich. And the difference now is the idea of a physical threat, the idea of assassination of journalists, which the rest of the world has been dealing with forever, and it's happening even today, which we've never had in America. We do have it now,
Do you ever think about it?
I do since June 28th of last year when my brother was killed. And,
Well,
yeah.
I was going to raise that in a moment, but you've brought it up right now. We sit here less than a year after you experienced the most extraordinary tragedy.
Yeah.
Because your brother, who is 6 years younger than yourself, he also was a newspaper man,
Yes.
an editor and a columnist on a small
The Annapolis
newspaper.
Gazette, but he'd worked for the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post. Yes.
But he'd gone out to Annapolis to an editorial job.
Yeah.
And he was in his office when a guy with a gun walked in, long-term grudge against that newspaper for reasons which are complicated, and the trial hasn't even started yet, so
Yeah.
we have to refer to him as a suspect rather than a convicted criminal. Anyway, he opens fire, kills 5 people,
Yes.
including your brother.
Who was just there trying to put out a neighborhood newspaper, community newspaper. Yeah. At a time when the debate and the anger towards journalists is quite visible at Trump rallies and almost, and threats of violence, and there had been threats against other papers and other journalists, and we don't know what motivated this guy. I don't know what's on his computer. The police haven't said if he was on these websites, but he'd threatened the paper before. He had threatened, and the irony was that nobody working in that newsroom had anything to do with the story that he was angry about that had appeared so many years ago, which was basically a police story where he had pleaded guilty to a crime, and they had reported it and done a column about his victim. Every word of both those pieces was true, but he held the grudge. He sued for libel. He got thrown out of every court, and it was the last thing anybody expected. But I don't know what was the trigger. What point did he feel comfortable doing that, or at least what pushed him to that point? We may never know. But the fact is that he killed 5 people, shot a couple others, and my brother was one of those who died, and it was the last thing I would have expected. And so at that point...
I mean, I'm trying to imagine what it must have been like for you, because you had for a long time written powerful columns about the dysfunctional relationship in the United States between guns and the people.
And the NRA in particular. Yeah.
You had called for meaningful gun control.
Yeah.
You had railed against the power of the NRA in this country. And then...
Yeah.
I guess you never expect it's going to come so close to home.
I don't think anyone does. As bad as I thought it was, before this happened, I know now that it's much worse, but in relation to the threat to reporters in the media, I think this is the first time where that's been out there, where you have people chanting at rallies. The poll numbers, the press has never been at the top of the popularity list. And since the beginning of this republic, it's never been a cherished institution, especially in the heat of political years. People will always say they're suspicious. People are always reluctant to believe something they don't want to believe about their candidate. They're always skeptical, cynical, or in some cases just turn a blind eye to corruption. But to have it out in the open, where you have people on websites advocating the murder of journalists, which you do, and they did before my brother was killed. That's new, it's appalling, and yes.
When you say it's new, are you in any sense tempted to blame Donald Trump for the creation of this atmosphere?
I think that it hasn't helped any to have someone who, every time there's a negative article about him, despite that, even in the Wall Street Journal, which his friend owns, just call it fake news, because it's.
Well, there's this line, the enemies of the people, the idea that journalists can be the enemy.
Well, that's absurd, and the media, the press, whether you get your news online or you get it from an old-fashioned newspaper on your doorstep, they're going to survive Donald Trump. They will survive, and they'll endure past Donald Trump. That we've seen the big institutions, such as you mentioned, New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, have all become more robust, more popular, being read by more people than have ever read those papers now, partly because of the fuss he's making about it.
But on the issue of guns, whether it be the big newspapers, whether it be powerful voices such as your own, and you wrote a column about this just a few days ago, the fact is that for all of the mass shootings, and there's no point reading the list, but everybody knows that even here in Florida, there have been a host of mass shootings. And yet not one of these incidents, for all of the grief, the prayers that are offered, produces a blind bit of political difference on the issue of gun control.
We had the former governor actually rose up against the NRA after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, and they raised the age limit for the purchase, I think, of semi-automatic rifles, and they, I believe, put in, there might have been a waiting period. There was a couple laws passed that the NRA had opposed, and it was the first time in many years.
But at state level.
At the state level, yeah. But you're right, and here's how dispiriting. My brother and I, we would talk about this because we had kids, and we talked about it after Sandy Hook, after all those elementary schools.
More than 20 children, young children.
Slaughtered. We both had talked after that and said, if that doesn't do it, if that doesn't bring this country to a new political reality about guns, then nothing's going to do it. And what happened after Sandy Hook? Nothing. Nothing at the federal level of any substance at all. So, am I surprised? No.
Let me ask you about the impact on you and your journalism, because it seems to me you've always written from the heart, and we've discussed the level of anger, but you've never made it deeply personal. You don't write much about family, about those dearest and nearest to you. No. And interesting, you said, you know what, Rob did. Rob was more open, more personal than I was.
Yes, he did. He loved that too, that I didn't.
And yet, in a sense, now that this has come home to you, do you feel, I don't know, whether a duty or a freedom to write more personally? Because you wrote a column which I did read a few weeks after Rob was killed. About, and you said the pain never ebbs, the tears never dry.
That was the most personal thing I've ever written.
Was it?
Oh yes, oh yes. Here's one reason I haven't, is because my background, as you mentioned, is more of an investigative journalist, and you're trained to keep yourself out of it. And of course, when I started doing the column, they wanted, I've thrown myself into it emotionally and with my point of view politically, but I don't. You hardly ever mention family. Part of it is because I think you should be able to make your case without that emotional tug. But second of all, because the nature of what I had done in the Herald, and even whom I was writing about during the columns, you have to remember what Miami in the 70s and 80s was, and the amount of violence and the drug. And I was writing about the cocaine wars. I was writing about individuals involved in Escobar and later and all those people and others, many others. And I was frequently writing about corrupt politicians who, in other words, I was making enemies.
You sure were.
And
dangerous enemies.
And when the columns started, I made more, because the only way to do it is honestly. And so if someone got caught doing something, I'd write about them. And most of the time, by the time I wrote about them, they had much bigger problems than some newspaper columnists writing about. They had much bigger legal problems. But at the same time, in the back of your mind, you're thinking all it takes is one person who's mad enough, and there's enough guns on the street. Even in those days in Miami, there was plenty. So I was always cautious about not giving, that I would be the target, and not giving away, where my kids were at school or where my, wife worked at the time, any of that. I was very cognizant of that, not out being paranoid, I was just being careful.
Has this changed anything from that point of view?
No, I can still do my job without writing about personal things, I think. In this case, Rob's death was something extraordinary, and it was on every network, and his face was on every news station, and he wasn't there to, be protected anymore. But there are people in my family that, were scared, are scared, and
For you?
I think for all of us, just it's a tough world, and it's a tough reality to face. I don't know that they're that worried about me, but I've always been. It's just not worth it. It's not worth the risk. I mean, it's one thing to
Has any of this made you question whether you want to carry on?
That's a good question. I think in the few weeks after he was killed, I wondered. I wondered, because I saw the pain that everyone else in my family was going through, and I did wonder whether, I had a good long run. I mean, and I've been with that newspaper for over 40 years, and there would be nothing to be ashamed of to walk away and just go off live on an island and write my books. There'd be nothing to stop me from doing that, and I wouldn't feel ashamed, but I would feel left out with what's going on in this country, not to have the privilege of having the voice that I have, and I mean the ability of the platform that I have, I should say. To lose that at a time when this country is in the kind of trouble that it's in, I would feel like left out and like I was cheating, taking the easy way out.
We began by talking about your commitment to this place, and yet, having had the conversation we've had, I'm wondering whether you, in recent times, have seriously thought about getting out of Florida.
There are days when something happens where I think enough is enough, and it's too late to save the place. And then the one thing I've compared it to, Stephen, if you understand, it's almost like you're sitting with a relative in the hospital, and they're fading away. And do you wait, or do you leave early? Do you bug out? And I'm not going to bug out. I mean, as long as they're fighting, as long as people are fighting, I've got to stay. My heart isn't anywhere else. And secondly, I've never lived anywhere else that I could write about with authority or with the kind of affection and sort of the bittersweet side as well, the anger too. I never cared about a place as much as I care about this. And for the purposes of my crazy novels and for the newspaper work, I think you need that kind of energy, you need that kind of emotional investment. So I can't see myself leaving.
That is a great place to end. Carl Hiaasen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It was really a pleasure. Thanks.